Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another double take. Today's double take features the 1954 film Touchez Pas Au Grisbi by Jacques Becker and L'assassin habite un 21, or The Murderer Lives at 21, by Clouseau from 1942. Now, these two films are interesting in their own right, but I decided to do a double take on them because of their influence and what they would kind of lead to in the future. So we'll start with Touchez Pas Au Grisbi. This is a Blu-ray from Studio Canal's Vintage World Cinema selection. It's got a really nice print. It's got an interview with Jeanette Vincendou, who, strangely enough, does an interview on this and other French Eureka releases. There's an interview with Jacques Becker, an interview with Jean Moreau, which is quite wonderful. Now, Touchez Pas Au Grisbi, or roughly translated as Keep Your Hands Off the Loot. Roughly, I'm sure subscriber Ben would give us a better translation than that. It stars Jean Gabin as an older gangster, and he and his pal Riton, we find out have done an airport gold bullion robbery. And a very young Jean Moreau happens to accidentally pass this on to a younger up-and-coming gangster in the underworld, played by Lino Ventura. This might have been his first film, or one of his first films. He'll probably appear in a later video coming soon to this channel. And obviously he wants to get his hands on the gold bullion. So it's a really simple, straightforward story. But what makes Touchez Pas Au Grisbi special is not only the execution of the film, because it's an excellent film, but if you think it kind of sounds familiar, then you're probably thinking it's the Jean-Pierre Melville film that's not directed by Melville. This was 1954. Melville's first foray into the underworld wouldn't really happen until 1956, Bob Le Flambeur. But Touchez Pas Au Grisbi must have been a huge influence on Melville. Melville had done Le Silence de Mer, his wonderful resistance film with a difference. And then he had done a couple of other films. The film before Bob Le Flambeur was a story about a nun. So it wasn't until Bob Le Flambeur in 1956 he kind of found his milieu that he would be famous for. But Touchez Pas Au Grisbi has all those kind of elements that we now recognise as Jean-Pierre Melville kind of gangster tropes, if you will, because again, Melville's more interested in atmosphere and psychology rather than kind of intricate plots and things like that. It's more about cool and atmosphere. I mean, Touchez Pas Au Grisbi, there's not that much imagination you need to extrapolate it into Bob Le Flambeur. Both films are about an ageing gangster or an ageing gambler who gets involved with a robbery. Obviously Jean Gabin in 1954 was a bit older, and that really helps the role, because this is essentially the famous big last job, which is a bit of a cliche, but never mind. And you can see the wear and tear in his life. Again, we see kind of midnight bistros and stuff like that. It's perhaps not as beautifully ornately shot in the kind of Paris gambling dens and the smoky nights the way Bob Le Flambeur is, but you still get that feeling he's kind of known by everybody. He has a reputation. He is a bit curt and to the point. He has a kind of passive-aggressive relationship with Riton, his best pal, who they did the robbery with. But he acts kind of cold and distant from him, but when rubber hits road, the themes of loyalty and kind of having the other guy's back really come into play. Again, it's a simple story. Lino Ventura, who again, I think this is one of his first films, is really excellent as the young, greedy gangster. Jean Moreau's kind of caught in between. There's lots of scenes in nightclubs, and you really get a sense of another world. You get a sense of, once it gets dark, creatures come out at night. It's just a beautiful film. The atmosphere, it has a nice action scene near the end. It's just so well done. But if you came to it cold, you would probably just think off the top of your head it's a Melville film that you hadn't heard of. But it's actually Jacques Becker, who himself, very much like Melville, didn't do a lot of films. He did Le Trou and Casse d'Or, and Montparnasse 19. But he didn't do a ton of work either. But as far as a template for what would come, obviously the French filmmakers were influenced by American cinema, the 30s and 40s, the film noirs, the gangster films, but they took them to a completely different level, again, where atmosphere was sometimes more important than having labyrinthine plots and intricate plots. It was more about the characters, it was more about kind of honour and rules, like Rififi, there's certain rules that you don't break, and if you break them, you're going to pay for it. I would highly recommend Touchez Pas Au Grisbi for the film that it is, and also the films that it would later inspire. You could argue some of those films surpass it, but it's still like a really excellent film. So we'll go on to The Murderer Lives at 21. This is Eureka Masters of Cinema, dual format, spine number 57 for those counting at home. And this is Clouzot's debut from 1942. Clouzot had done a lot of writing for films, but he was becoming more and more annoyed that his scripts weren't actually being turned into the films that he thought they should be, so he ended up directing this himself, and it is an amazing film. I would say, I prefer it slightly to Touchez Pas Au Grisbi, even though Touchez Pas Au Grisbi is fantastic. But The Murderer Lives at 21 is just like so much fun, which you don't necessarily associate with Clouzot. Again, this one has another interview with Jeanette Vincent-Deux, who's also in the Eureka release of Le Silence de Mer by Melville, and obviously there's a booklet about Clouzot, because as we all know, Clouseau was a bit of a character, shall we say. I mean, Jeanette von Sandu talks about how the verbal and physical abuse on Clouseau's sets, how he would slap actresses to get better performances out of them. Strangely enough, couldn't really do that nowadays. His then partner, Susie Dallaire, who was also in Quai des Orfèvres and The Murderer Lives at 21, tells stories about how he used to slap her on set. He famously slapped Brigitte Bardot on set, and she slapped him back. But as Jeanette von Sandu says in the extras, you know, all the actors that worked with him recognised his talent, as if that was somehow a justification of him going around slapping everybody. So he was one of those guys that wasn't particularly a great human being, but he was a great artist. And this, as a debut, is just stunningly good. So this is a serial killer film from 1942, which is quite early. Obviously M had been 11 years earlier. And this is a film that on one hand doesn't seem like a Clouseau film because it is really funny, but it's black comedy. But then there's other things in it that makes it totally a Clouseau film. But there's parts in it you can also see into the future of other films. We see a killing, the first killing in the film, we see from the murderer's POV, and it automatically reminds you of Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, the opening of Peeping Tom from 1960. The vast majority of the action is set in a boarding house, and again I was just getting the Lady Killers from 1955. It just reminded me so much of the Lady Killers. So there's lots of things you can see in the film, not only projecting into Clouseau's future career, but also films in the future. So like I said, it's a serial killer film. The inspector in charge, played by Pierre Fresnay, who would be in other Clouseau films, and again Susie Dallaire is in other Clouseau films. There's a lovely scene, a quick kind of scene, as we see the trouble rolling downhill from the government down to the head of the police, to the commissioner, to the inspector's boss, who pretty much says if you don't solve this in a few days you're going to get sacked. Again, it's a really funny film. It's only about 84 minutes, but that's actually a good thing because it's just so tight, so economical. Like I say, I absolutely loved it. It's an absolute blast. So he gets a tip from a snitch that he gets an address. So the serial killer, I should say, the serial killer's trademark is a calling card, which just says Monsieur Durand, which, as Jeanette von Sandu says in the extras, Durand is a fairly familiar French surname, so it's pretty much an everyman name. So it's like, I suppose, in Britain if it was just signed Mr. Smith or something like that, Mr. Brown. So he leaves a calling card. So the inspector gets a tip that lives at this address, which turns out to be a boarding house. So the inspector goes undercover as a priest, as you would, to try and weed out the killer. His girlfriend, played by Susie Dallaire, who's a singer and can't get work, and the agent who she's speaking to suggests that if she got her name in the papers she would have more chance of getting a gig. So she decides that she'll find Monsieur Durand, the serial killer. They don't call him a serial killer, obviously, in 1942, but the killer, she'll find him first, and then she'll get her name in the papers and she'll get a singing career. So you have the two of them in partnership and also trying to get the killer at the same time. Again, there's lots of just lovely comedy in it, even though again it shifts into dark territory just for all us Clouseau fans. So in the boarding house you have this array of characters. You have a doctor who is in the colonies and may have done terrible things in the colonies. You have this illusionist, magician who's a little bit dodgy. You have this failed writer who comes up with the idea that for her next book, that one of the people in the house is actually the murderer. You have a little kind of doll maker who's making these Monsieur Duron dolls who are faceless, which is a nice little touch. So you have this odd cast of characters. You have a ex-boxer who's blind and his nurse who's having relations with him. People complain about hearing noises in the attic. Lights go on and off quite a lot. And obviously bodies keep mounting as Monsieur Durand keeps killing people, and various members of the household are under suspicion and are arrested at different points during the film before we get to the quite wonderful denouement of the film. I mean, like I said, it's only 85 minutes long. It's an absolute blast, and as far as debuts go, it is just absolutely wonderful. Obviously Clouseau, like I said earlier, was an interesting character. Obviously during the occupation of France by the Germans, he worked for a film studio that was controlled by the Germans, so after the war, and also people didn't like Le Corbeau, which was about kind of telling on people and collaborating. He was out of work for a while and he had a bad rep before he kind of got back into the game, essentially. I mean, again, the film does have dark overtones about why the killings are happening and how far back the kind of genesis of it goes. But there's also, before the trope of the villain explaining why he does things, obviously the classic is the Bond villain who lays out his entire plan. This one has that device, but it wonderfully not subverts it, but it's a wonderfully different take on it. And this was 1942, before it was kind of a thing, even though I'm sure like in Sherlock Holmes films that happens as well. But that's really playful and really well done. The film is acted brilliantly. Like I said, the script is fantastic, the dialogue's wonderful, the relationships are fantastic. It's just an absolute joy, which again isn't necessarily, the word joy isn't particularly a word you would use perhaps with Clouseau's later work. As great as it is, you wouldn't necessarily say, many of his films are joyful, but it is an absolute blast. So I would rate this slightly higher than Touchez Pas Au Grisbi, but not by much, and they're both just excellent films that I would highly recommend if you haven't seen them already. Not only for the films that they are, but kind of the foreshadowing of what would come later in French cinema and also in Clouseau's career. So thanks very much for watching this episode of Double Take. Please leave comments below if you've seen one or both of these films. Let me know what you think of them, and hopefully you'll join me again for more Double Takes. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying thank you and farewell.